I will be right back. I've got to make sure the door is closed and everything.
Mhm. Hi all. Just to break the ice, I just wanted to say that thank you so much for coming. To those early birds who have already joined in, we're just going to be waiting until the event's official start time to start. So in the meantime, just hang out. Feel free to spread the word. And yeah, thank you.
All right, it's 9 a.m., so let's go ahead and get this started. Hello, everyone. My name is Nikki, and welcome to this year's ShutdownPL at ICFP. Today, we're having a wonderful keynote by Jean-Hid Manid, followed by a Q&A, and then following that, we're having a short discussion in the lounge. Feel free to submit the questions for the Q&A while the talk is going on. And if you need anything, feel free to get in touch with any one of us organizers, either myself, David, or Justin. Before we introduce our speaker more thoroughly, we'd like to thank Bloomberg for their generous sponsorship this year. An important issue in accessibility and inclusion is compensating people for their labor. Otherwise, opportunities only go to those who can afford to work for free. So thank you to Bloomberg for allowing us to be able to compensate people. Now to introduce our speaker, Jean-Hid Manid is an open source contributor, a contributor to the C and C++ standardization, and a project editor for the C language. They're currently working at Shepherd's Oasis and studying at Columbia and are looking to start a PhD soon. And we look forward to their talk. Yeah, go ahead and kick that off.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Nikki, for that introduction. Very much appreciate it. Gosh, this is a heavy talk. Let's get started with it right away, shall we? And I enabled him, brought him into our community, validated his existence here by allowing him to associate himself with me, by giving him credibility, by working with him. For this, I am so terribly sorry. For this, I am so unspeakably sorry. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. No matter where you are in the world, I'm glad you're here. This is a talk about seeking good trouble before it goes potentially really bad. And it's about ways that you can develop anti-jerk systems in STEM, in science, technology, education, and mathematics. My name is Jean-Hid Manid, but I run around with the moniker of the PhD. Don't quite have that PhD yet. Working on it. Climbing that academic ladder as fast as I can to see if we can, if I can actually, have the nickname that I was given a while ago kind of more earned, I guess. And so this talk that I'm going to be doing here is going to be a little bit different than the ones I've done before. If you might not be familiar with my work, but I've done something similar to this before. I gave a video last time. Link is almost all the slides will have links at the bottom. And of course, so when the slides are released, you can be able to click on them and follow them. Or if you're masochistic, you can pause the video, type in the link manually. But the last video kind of was a lot about statistics, facts, and data from all over the world, right? We're talking East Asia, South Asia. We're talking about Africa. We're talking about, Europe, Russia, South America, North America, right? We got data from everywhere. We conglomerated that into why the community is the way it is. What's going to make this talk a little bit different is that rather than relying on kind of this 10,000-foot view of the world and everything that's going on in it, instead, I'm going to be taking the approach of kind of like a case study, right? Where we take a look at some very specific instances that happened very recently that kind of show exactly what has been going on in this industry and the things that people have had to face and deal with as they've dealt with this sort of colossal spin out of what happens when your communities do not properly regulate or handle themselves. So before we get into the main case study and the main story, we'll take another story before that story. This is Edmund Humenberger. You see this as pictures here. All of this, pictures, data, everything, all of this comes from publicly sourced stuff. Everything that I'm going to show you, you can find online. And again, all of it's going to be sourced. But this picture is is Edmund. Edmund's kind of good looking, charismatic too, right? He's a nice looking guy, right? He got the beard, the full beard, the everything is connected. He's got a great smile. It's wonderful, right? The problem with the whole setup, though, is that Edmund is also a monster, and I don't mean that in the happy, oh, he's got like fins or something, or oh, he's he could transform into a werewolf, or oh, he's got scales or something cool like that. No, I mean Edmund's actually a monster. His reveal was started off by a name by the name of Olaf Kindgren. Olaf made this tweet around February 2nd, and he was basically saying that maybe today is the day that we're going to kick Nazis out from our communities, or at least let them not know that they're not welcome in the space, right? That they don't belong here. This started on February 2nd, early in the morning, at least according to my time. And then it just kind of kept going. Revelation after revelation began to be poured out by person after person, response after response, quote tweet after quote tweet. And on Twitter, the thread was pulled, and they pulled and pulled, and they discovered more and more and more of exactly what was going on with this man named Edmund. It turns out it was really bad. Everybody who attempted to work with him got really bad vibes from him. And the more people worked with it and the more people tried to do stuff with it, whether they were well-known or little-known people working in what was at the time known as the Open EDA, Open Electronic Design Automation community, these people spent an exorbitant amount of time going through Edmund's abuses, whether he was driving people away to work on stuff, whether he was trying to recruit them and then throw them out later and use them up, all sorts of shenanigans that ultimately the community ended up paying for. Of course, it wasn't just about his work and professional abuses, it was also about his personal abuses. Edmund's rap sheet goes back a long time. I don't mean rap sheet in terms of, official convictions or whatever, but his legal and bad behavior rap sheet does go on for quite some time. He was made immortal by a GitHub.io site that began to document a lot of his abuses. In fact, they even were able to finally connect him as the person who in the 1990s attempted to copyright Linux so he could sweep the whole thing out from under everybody else. Now, his attempt didn't quite get all the way there. The only reason it took so long for people to connect the dots was that Edmund had this very, very interesting tactic. He would legally lock down whoever he would get into legal disputes with. And so the reason it was very hard to find, the reason it was very hard for people to trace it, is because it took them, a lot of people who with a little bit too much time on their hand, bless their souls, started to do some Twitter sleuthing and everything else, and eventually went in contact the German registry for patents and legal disputes and everything else, and they actually began to find all of the information about Edmund. And that's when they discovered that he has a number of legal disputes. That's when they figured out that he has aggressive confidentiality clauses against most engineers, and that's why they can't say anything about any of it. And of course, at the bottom there in the green, you see that he has a bunch of racist tweets, and I'm not going to show them. Even the ones in English are pretty bad, and they get even worse when he starts speaking Dutch. So we're just not gonna talk about that. But again, everything's sourced, so you can go click there if you're painfully curious about everything that Edmund said and done and horrible things that he's committed to. But it's all there now. But But what about that opening quote, right? I mean, you said this is a case study, right? Not a statistical thing. So, and this kind of just seems like you have an axe to grind with this Edmund person. Well, thankfully, I'm not in the FPGA community at all. I'm not in the Open EDA community at all. So, unfortunately, I've got no stake in this horse, or no horse in this race, whatever the expression is in English. But the opening quote, right? That quote came 2 days after Olaf's reveal began to explode all over the internet on February 4th. And it was by somebody by the name of Claire Zenia Wolf. Claire is the mother of OpenEDA, period. Anyone who's doing anything with FPGAs and anything else like it, and they're not under 5,000 NDAs under a company, basically uses Claire tools. The state of the industry would not be where it is without Claire. She's the vice chair of the BitManip task group, and of course, helps author the BitManip doc for RISC-V. And the quote that I started with in the opening was a quote in this thread that began on February 4th, where she talks about enabling this man, bringing him in the community, and giving him credibility, right? Of course, I mean, if you doubt Claire's credentials, I mean, just literally just look it up. She's on the RISC-V website. She has her own website. There's an extensive paper trail. She has awards. She's done basically a ton of amazing things that have effectively shaped this industry for the better and made it so that it was out of the iron grip of a few very cagey companies and their dubious technical specifications. The reason this is relevant is because Claire, in particular, was Edmund's victim, right? He trapped Claire. He trapped Claire into thinking that she was nothing. She trapped Claire into thinking that she didn't know what she was doing, that she didn't have any ability to get anything done. This intensified when Claire began her transition, right? So before, Claire was presenting as a man to the world and everything else, but a little bit later into life, Claire began to present as she truly was. And so as she began to transition, her confidence grew, but also it put Claire under Edmund's radar, right? Edmund is a fascist, right? He's a neo-Nazi. He believes all of the stuff. He believes everything, right? People have, again, you can go through his tweets, you can go to that website. The man, it's unfortunate, but neo-Nazi Austrian is unfortunately not exactly a very particularly descriptive a way of describing someone, because apparently there's so many, but he definitely fits the bill. And as this went on, Edmund's abuses got worse and worse, right? He suddenly fires Claire from their company, right? Because as you begin to figure out, as you go through this thread, as you read the history, you figure out that Edmund started a company with Claire quite some time ago, and that's how he's in the EDA industry. That's how he's in the electronic design automation industry, right? That's how he's in chip design and FPGAs and open hardware and firmware and all that stuff, right? That's how he ended up here, because he met Claire early in life before Claire transitioned and took advantage of that, started a company, and began his grift off of Claire's hard work. So things got worse, right? Firing Claire, terminating other people. It got so bad that basically almost everyone either resigned or was fired. She hired on, somebody who else was a known transphobic individual in the community, because again, that's how he those are the kinds of people he surrounds himself with, and it spiraled out of control. As this reveal was going on, other people, of course, had to chime in. Some people thought it was like, okay. They're like, oh, whenever I hear things like we need to exclude people from our communities, I suspect there's a woke mob behind it. I can't find any information about this conflict other than unsubstantiated claims from one side, which is just even at the time on February 5th, if you go through Olaf's thread, if you go through Claire's thread, multiple receipts are provided, multiple corroborating stories, other people who worked at the company saying they're resigning and leaving and doing other things, right? All of that was there. But of course, people have, they want, this is not, I mean, this is literally not America, but is this not Austria? Is this not Germany? It's not the European Union. Don't we have rights here? This is exactly how this is supposed to work, right? Right. At some point, it got ridiculous. For example, the moment after Olaf posted his thread and began, giving out receipts about everything that Edmund had done, other people also started showing up. And now this person's Russian, so if you have to forgive their English, obviously they're trying to communicate in English, not their native language. But of course, again, there's this idea that the cancel culture was coming for Edmund, right? That he was being destroyed by the woke. And ultimately, they even painted Olaf as trying to have a commercial conflict of interest. The man tries to copyright Linux, is a patent troll, locks people into terrible contracts, and you're talking about commercial conflicts of interest for the people who are trying to get a neo-Nazi out of their community. Interesting priorities. So what ends up happening is that this starts becoming an uphill battle, right? And I don't mean uphill battle in terms of like, how do we get free of Edmund? Because that is a battle in and of itself, and it's a hard one, and it's one that's hard to fight. But particularly at the top of Claire's thread, a man by the name of Hector quote tweeted Claire. Now, Hector's really important because Hector is a long-standing facet of the OpenEDA community. He is actually porting Apple's M1 Silicon to Linux using the with Asahi Linux. He has defeated the perceptual hash of people who will claim that they can, use perceptual hashes. If you haven't been paying attention to current events, where people are trying to use perceptual hashes to detect CSAM on phone devices and do client-side scanning of all of your stuff so that they can prove that you have dangerous material. Hector publicly defeated that algorithm by changing a single pixel at a single byte value, and making the perceptual hash, which is supposed to detect images that are similar, confuse itself by just changing that single pixel value by one by +1 in one of its RGB bytes. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Hector knows his stuff. And the interesting part here is that Hector made it clear that this isn't the only person that Edmund hurt. IcoTC is Edmund's handle on Twitter. And he says that we need to be better at calling out dangerous people like him and excluding them from our communities, right? This is why the cake avatar person was like, I don't know. I'm not sure we should be excluding somebody. It sounds like the woke mob is here. This is what he was replying to. But that brings an interesting dimension to this. Did Edmund attack more than Linux and Claire? Right? Like, sure, maybe I'd do some intervening grift, but how bad was it exactly? And if you go through and you read more, you begin to understand. This is a continuation of the tweet, right? I've glued it together here. So obviously it's part of the opening quote. For this I am so terribly sorry. For this I am so unspeakably sorry. I saw what he was doing to the members of this community. I saw how he behaved towards the people here. I knew of his alt Twitter account, the one where he was posting all of his racist screeds. I did nothing. I should have quit years ago. Instead, I just threatened to quit again and again and never followed through. I did nothing. Claire isn't Edmund's only victim. Claire is the most prominent because he started a company with her, right? And was doing work and all of that. But Claire isn't Edmund's only victim. And Claire knew this. Claire knew that Edmund was attacking, defaming, and destroying many, many, many other people. And in the several years that she worked with him, I believe almost over a decade, probably even more, it was okay. While other people were grasping at straws, while Olaf was collecting evidence based on the very scant few moments he's had with him, Claire had a full dossier of his entire behavior, and she did nothing with it. You know, often we like to complain about there's no many women in computer science. There's not many, you know, underrepresented minorities in computer science from whatever part of the world you're in, whatever you define that at, right? Whether it's Muslim individuals you don't see, whether it's people of Southeast Asian descent, whether it's people of South Asian descent, whether it's African, whether you're looking at people in South America and how it's grossly male, whether you're looking at PhD programs and you're noticing that when you go from undergraduate all the way to graduate, all the way to PhD, you notice that the global research pool basically becomes 72% male and a lot of the other women and everyone else drops off. There's a lot of questions about how did we get here and why is it so bad, right? Especially why is it so bad in PhD programs? Why is it so bad in the industry? And one of the reflexive things that people say is, oh, the pipeline just isn't putting enough people, isn't putting enough applications, isn't putting enough talented candidates. And if you watch my old video, I actually debunk a lot of this. Again, I'm not going to go through all the numbers here, right? And if you go to the video again, there's cited sources. You can, go get there's cited sources in the video description, right? But we know that educational improvements were happening effectively across the board, especially in early education, right? Everything from kindergarten all the way until you finish your primary and secondary school, and you start getting into actual university or college, whatever you call it in your culture or country. And we know that the numbers were actually improving. More women were graduating, more underrepresented minorities were graduating. That academics, while the progress is slow, academics were holding up their end of the bargain. They were doing what they were supposed to do. But what we were finding is that there was legal suppression, that there was in-industry problems. Right? So here's Claire talking, again, in the same thread, talking about not being able to say an EDA. That the non-compete from this ghost ship company that Edmund has fired so many people from is going to prevent her from working in the industry she loves. This is not the only person Edmund has messed with, right? Claire admitted as much. How many other people are stuck in non-competes? How many other people are under confidentiality agreements? How many other people can't say a single word? It's not just the pipeline. Our industry and our community leaders are failing us. Underrepresented minorities leave their jobs, leave their industries at 1.5 to 2.5 the rate of their peers. Again, this is a slide from my old video. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into the statistics. You can go view that video and you can get as well informed as you would like to. But the reality of the matter is that it's the higher levels, that it's the community leadership that's letting us down, that's turning a blind eye, that says, I know something bad here is happening, but it's just not for me to fix it. They'll complain about the numbers. It's so bad here. There's so many, I barely see another person like me here. I barely see any diverse representation in X industry. I barely see any diverse representation in machine learning. What happened at Google with Timnit Gebru? What happened in this place and that place and everywhere else? And we keep complaining about this stuff. And we keep saying that we need to put more women and girls in school, and the academics do that, they graduate them, and then we fail them. By the time most women go 10 to 20 years in this industry, computer science, in the engineerings, 2 out of 3 of them leave. You could put the pipeline on full burst. You could graduate huge classes composed entirely of women. You can boot camp the world into the industry. And they are resilient coders. A bunch of other places that are all boot camping and trying to put more people out there, get them jobs, connect them with employers. The problem isn't at the bottom. This isn't a foot fungus. The rot is at the head. For every Kate Gregory, for every Nikki, for every Julia Glegg, for every Lisa Lippincott, for every single woman that you see in a high place doing an amazing job in STEM, there should be 2 more of them. But we lose them. And an overwhelming number of them, a shockingly high number of them, is due to harassment. It's due to being questioned for their abilities. It's due to being hurt. It's due to being legally locked in. It's being abused, and then because they don't have any power, being forced into bad legal situations. People like Edmund. Maybe even some people you know. So we always have this question. We always say this: how do we get more women into math? How do we get more Black people in engineering? How do we get more Pacific Islanders into technology? How do we get this? How do we get that? And we never have the question of how do we get these misogynists out of here that are bleeding our industry dry of its talent. Edmund is no Claire. She couldn't hold a candle to what Claire has done for the electronic design automation community. Not even close. But that man can force Claire out the window, and several others. That man can endanger an entire industry, can hold back everything with patent trolling and everything else. But all of us are sitting here and asking, I don't know. I think we need to fix the pipeline. It's not the pipeline. It's where we're all ending up and the people who are still there. This is not an uncommon occurrence in the programming community in particular. We love to leave people behind. We love to strip people of their humanity. To some of us, it's just fun. Let me give you an example, because again, this is a case study-based approach, right? This one I'm a little bit more involved in, but thankfully all the other stuff is. This is thankfully just a background. This is a tweet of mine. You can go find it. It's out there. It's got a ridiculous number of likes. I sent an email to something called GCC. That's the GNU Compiler Collection. Stallman at this time had been reinstated to the board of directors. If you don't know what the name Stallman means, it stands for Richard M. Stallman. And if you're anything or anyone in open source, you understand that he is the leader, the face of, the progenitor of the free software movement, and headed at one point as president the Free Software Foundation after some controversy because of things that he had done that were pretty bad. he stepped down from being president. But around this time, around March of this year, he was surprised reinstated almost as part of the Free Software Foundation's board. This conversation was about whether or not he deserved to continue to sit at the top of the direction group in GCC. They have a direction group, a steering committee, as they call it. And those people are supposed to steer GCC in the right direction, right? Help make technical decisions, help make vision direction, and everything else. And a lot of weird accusations started floating around. Not necessarily about Stallman, but about the stuff that Stallman had. Let me explain. These are three individuals: Martin, Eric, and Bruce. If you've ever been part of open source, you've probably heard of Bruce PERENS or Eric Raymond. They are free software and open source advocates extraordinaire. They have their own Wikipedia pages. The guy on the left is a little less known. His name is just Martin. All three of these people chimed in when the debate was raging on GC mailing lists and a couple other places, when an open letter was published, and a bunch of people signed it to ask RMS to resign from the board at the Free Software Foundation because they didn't want any of his creepy behavior and other things that he was doing to continue to jeopardize the free software movement. And of course, Stallman's the list of grievances with Stallman's behavior is pretty long. I won't avail you every single one of them here today, but suffice to say that he is not the greatest person in the world. But one interesting thing that began happening as this kind of debate was unfurling in March was this idea that Stallman was disabled. Oh, that's an interesting take. Stallman's disabled. Martin spent some time saying, I don't think it's especially controversial to claim that Stallman would have been diagnosed with some form of autism. Someone like that is absolutely a poor choice for a leadership position. But at the same time, doesn't diversity also mean diversity of neurodivergent people? Okay, so we're getting into some diversity arguments here, right? Bruce PERENS takes a different approach to defending Stallman. Still couched in disability, but kind of a lawyerish take, a legal take. In the news is the shunning of 68-year-old autistic computer programmer named Richard Stallman, known as the founder of the free software movement. He goes on to explain that, he has autism and that it's bad for people to shun this man and the things that he's done, and to ask him to resign from the board of directors once more. And so he concludes with, thus, they, Free Software Foundation, are bound by the Americans with Disability Act and other applicable law to make accommodations for a handicapped employee. Mr. Stallman's behavior clearly has a basis in his handicap. Interesting legal take. And of course, Eric Raymond, who on the same mailing threads that I had responded to, says this: I intended a weaker observation that driving away a large number of, excuse my French, smart autistic assholes and non-assholes with poor social skills is not necessarily a good trade for the people the project might recruit by being more welcoming. An assumption that if you try to get rid of jerks out of your community, all you'll be doing is making sure that you'll decrease the quality of your project. That it technically won't be as good because you'll be losing all these really smart and autistic people, right? This is my response to all that, is no. And it's not no because I disagree with them on like some opinion, and so because their opinion is wrong, I think they're wrong. This isn't, me trying to assert my opinion here. This is a factual based observation. Stallman ain't autistic. He's not autistic. Well, how do you know that? I mean, if all these people are going to run around and say that he would either be diagnosed as autistic or that he is autistic or that he probably has it, or shouldn't we accept neurodivergent people? How do you know? Right? Stallman's not autistic. Well, I know because unlike apparently every single other person who claims that they know Stallman in a personal capacity or that they've clearly read his works and his website, I actually read what Stallman said. This is an interview that was done for Stallman for some of his work. And when you read that interview, they talk about a book that Stallman had previously published that calls him borderline autistic, right? He doesn't commit to it. He doesn't want to say that he's actually autistic, but he says he's borderline autistic. And so when they cited that excerpt from the book to Stallman during this interview, Stallman said that the assessment was exaggerated. I wonder about it, but that's as far as it goes. Now, it's clear I do not have Asperger's. I don't have most of the characteristics of that. You can read the whole interview if you want to. Again, links at the bottom. But it's pretty clear to me that Stallman doesn't consider himself to have Asperger's or autism. Now, he goes on to say that he might have, quote, a shadow version of it, but a shadow version of it doesn't qualify him under the American with Disabilities Act. It certainly doesn't mean that the Free Software Foundation has to use that as a basis for accepting his poor behavior, which just goes to show you that, you shouldn't take legal advice from software developers, and you should get yourself a real lawyer every time you have to deal with legal stuff. But Eric and Martin and everybody else was complaining that aren't we doing our community a disservice by getting rid of jerks because autistic people, they're socially awkward and they're predisposed to being jerks. They're predisposed to being, as he calls it, an asshole, right? It's funny. These people will assign to a man who has publicly, on stage, in spoken word, in writing, denied that he's autistic, denied that he has Asperger's, which is the older form of autism, or the older name for it. Because again, autism is a spectrum, as they say. And yet these people will just assign it to him. The man can come out, he can write, he can say, I'm not autistic, I don't have it, there's nothing to do with me, right? Like, yeah, maybe I have a shadow version of it, but and some of them even pretend like, oh well, if we had better tools earlier, he would have been diagnosed earlier. People get diagnosed later in life. I got diagnosed later in life. I'm neurodivergent. And yet someone like Martin would like to claim that neurodivergent people maybe don't belong in leadership positions. Maybe don't have the stuff to lead a movement, to do anything that big, right? That maybe they should just quietly be put in the back and not do anything. Martin, I am the editor of the C language. I glue the standard together. The standard that powers every single device you have ever laid your hands on. A neurodivergent person does that. So no, Martin. Being neurodivergent doesn't mean that I'm less of a human being. Being neurodivergent doesn't mean I'm less capable. But that's all this is, really. It's the sinister underbelly. That if you're autistic, you're predisposed to being a jerk. If you're autistic, you're predisposed to being a creep. If you're autistic, you're predisposed to being less than human. They won't understand anything about you. They will assign magical qualities from out of thin air onto you because you're neurodivergent, because you have autism, because you're autistic. They're not looking for balanced takes. They're not fighting against the woke mob here. They're just looking to scapegoat people. And in this case, they scapegoat an entire group of people. We notice this stuff. when you do it. We notice it when you decide that today is a good day to tell everybody that neurodivergent people aren't good for leadership, that neurodivergent people are creeps by default. Stallman is well taken care of. He doesn't need your defense. But the rest of us sure are taking note, Martin, Bruce, Eric, of the way you think of us, the way we're disposable to you. Always this weird association. This is another quote from Eric Raymond. It's much more direct conflict in the hacker culture than elsewhere because so many potential contributors are high-functioning autists. That makes downstream consequences of politeness enforcement a lot more damaging to the product's ability to ship code than they would otherwise be. This is patently false. I don't need to be rude to get my job done. That's something that Eric S. Raymond made up. It ain't the truth. But he'll proudly talk about it. And he'll keep talking about it. Autistic people showed up in that mailing list thread. I was one of them. And we said how it's disingenuous that people keep associating autism with this kind of behavior. But he kept doing it anyway. Bruce PERENS was directly confronted about the fact that Stallman has said he doesn't have autism. And Bruce PERENS admitted that he knows that Stallman said he doesn't have autism, but he wrote it anyway. It was never, ever about protecting disabled people. It was never about protecting autistic people. For them, it's a game to them. It's a debate. It's an abstract concept in the sky. None of these people will take a moment to go and talk to David Perry and talk to his son with Down syndrome, but they'll be happy to write a long, beautiful defense of Stallman saying that today is a good day to get your son or daughter before they're born tested in the womb to see if they have Down syndrome and consider aborting them. And yeah, sure, he changed the entry and added some nuance, and I'm sure that's fine, but we're not dumb. We can hear you. Contrary to popular belief, we can see you. We know what you're saying. It's not Stallman you need to be worried about. It's everybody else you're painting with this terrible, horrible brush in your community. Why are we not human to you? Why is politeness the thing that will trip neurodivergent people? Why is getting rid of jerks in our community the thing that will trip divergent people? Why do you think that that's what will get rid of people like me? Why do we cede to this disingenuous framing? And I'm shocked to say that it works. Someone I looked up to, Libstud C++ contributor, tweeted out Martin's article and said, this is the balanced take we need in this debate. That's it. That neurodivergent people shouldn't hold leadership positions and probably aren't capable of doing anything. That's it. That's your balanced take. I contributed to Libstud C++. My code is now shipping on millions of devices. And that's what the lead developer of the thing thinks about that article. A balanced take. It's a good take. Martin did a good job. Why do we see this disingenuous framing? My friends get scared. They cite Martin's article. What about neurodivergent people? What if we get thrown under the bus? You're talking about some crazy, manic specter of the future when they're already doing it. They're already equating being a jerk with being autistic. They're already equating being creepy, not understanding boundaries, sexually harassing people with being neurodivergent. The ableism is, we don't even have to talk about Stallman at this point. We could just talk, we can have a whole shindig about Martin and Bruce and Eric. The problem here isn't even Stallman at this point. The ableism is that people are assuming that autistic people have to be like this. That's the ableism, and that's the ableism in the community. It's not anywhere else. Stallman will always be Stallman. If you read his biography, that much is clear. When the man decided that he didn't want to do a single other homework or written assignment, he never did it. Stallman will always be Stallman. But the rest of you? So where to? Right? How do you make anti-jerk systems in STEM? Well, the first part would be to enforce the rules on the books. How many IRC channels for the older folk? How many Discords? How many Slacks? How many places you go into? One of the first rules is don't be a jerk. Excuse my French. Don't be a dick. Don't be an asshole. And you can't even manage to enforce that for the people in your community. And you wonder why things are so bad. Enforce the rules on the books for everybody. It's not hard. It's not even like a magical, mythical concept that hasn't been proven. The hash include Discord, hash include CS+ has proven that if you make a community that is welcoming and caring and you enforce the rules, people in there can have a good time. There are standards people in there having conversations about the standard. There are beginners getting beginner help, learning together, sharing together. This ain't a magical unicorn that doesn't exist. It's literally just enforcing the rules already on the books. Don't be a jerk. Actually apply the enforcement. That's what's lacking in your communities. You have a bunch of people who have a vested interest in being jerks, and they're at really high places in the community, and because you don't want to upset their fees, you don't want to hurt their feelings, you don't do what's right for your community. And they run roughshod over everybody, Edmund, Eric, Martin, whoever else. And they get away with it. They get away with the disingenuous framing. They get away with treating disabled people like subhuman garbage. Every time. And if you have decent rules, stop allowing Nazis. At any point, when you realize that you're in business with a Nazi, you should be planning your exit escape. Claire was in the same situation where she literally realized she was working with a Nazi. She had advanced knowledge. But I did nothing. Of course, that all turned back on Claire. She had to fight for her life to get out of that non-compete and actually work in her industry. And I'm happy to report that Claire did eventually make it out of that. Her friend James posted up a GoFundMe. They funded her legal defense, and she was able to get Edmund to stop. But that's because Claire's the mother of all FPGAs. What happened to every other person who wasn't Twitter famous, who wasn't the mother of FPGAs? Where are they? What happened to them? You don't need to wait for a Nazi to turn on you. You don't need to wait for a Nazi to turn on your best friend in your community. You don't need to wait for a literal fascist to do what the fascist ideology says they will do every single time. We had a whole world war over this. You know better, or at least you should. And maybe the examples in this presentation will get you to understand that a little bit better. It's not just another ideology to have a debate about. It's the actual belief that everything else aside from you should be exterminated, should be put underfoot, should be subjected to whatever whims and beliefs you have. That's not compatible with anyone else's anything. Understand that. Get used to it. And stop it before it strangleholds the greatest contributors of your community. Stop bleeding out women. Stop bleeding out minorities. Stop bleeding out anyone who doesn't fit their narrative. Your community is worth so much more than that. Share early and share often. The number of people who had red flags about Edmund was through the roof. The only reason they didn't come forward is because Claire kept backing him up. Whisper networks here and there, everybody telling them how bad Edmund was, but quietly through whispers because they couldn't face him head on. And yet, the moment Olaf posted that thread, the moment people started coming out, everybody had everything to say about Edmund. There are red flags. Trust your gut. It's there for a reason. It's literally kept our species alive. Share early, share often. I understand that some of you are in a situation where you can't be doing that. But if you are a Claire, if you are at the head of your industry, if you are the mother of FPGAs, you shouldn't be building up people like Edmund. Save that for actual people who have stuff to contribute to your communities. No more monsters. No more monsters. Doesn't matter how good their smile is. Doesn't matter how charismatic they are. Doesn't matter how photogenic. No more monsters. Thank you. Thank you so much for sticking through that. Obviously, that's a heavy presentation with a lot to go through. I'm glad that you stuck it out. If you watched this on video, I'm glad you watched the whole thing. It's a lot. Some quick thanks. All the media, background image and stuff I use came from these folks. If you get the slides for this, a lot of these are links to PayPal's, Twitters. You can follow them, donate to them, their photography work. They obviously, and a lot of them release it for free so that you can benefit from it with nice looking presentations and everything else. So, do that. Also, if you want somebody who does speaking, advising, contracting, consulting, whatever else, send emails to these folks. Sharp Oasis. It's their logo. Inquiries at oasis.org, or just go to oasis.org and check things out. And now would be a good time for questions. I think we have some time left. We can take some questions.
Thank you, Janit, for a great presentation. Folks, please use the Q&A feed to submit your questions. Due to time, we'll be selecting those that are the most upvoted. So just a heads up.
Okay, looks like we've got one question, maybe?
Yeah, we can get started. So the first question reads, if one doesn't have enforcement power, how does one convince people who can enforce "don't be a jerk" that more subtle isms should be addressed?
That's always a tough one, right? In the scenario I talked about here, Claire was the one with power, right? And she, as she admitted, she built up Edmund. She made the monster. In the case that you don't have power, it's a lot more of a tricky dance. In some case, right, because especially it depends on where you live and everything, but there's a lot of places where there aren't good social safety nets and everything else, right? So if you decide to go toe to toe and they terminate you from your job, or they make things miserable for you at your workplace, or they make things miserable for you when you are attempting to finish your degree or whatever else, it becomes a lot harder to make this happen. And so in that case, that's where you have to start getting into other kinds of enforcement, which I haven't talked about here. But a lot of it goes into forming support networks amongst people that you know can help, finding ways to either get away from or transfer from the individual, right? If they're a person with a position in a position of power above you, and they're the ones, you know, doing the harassment and everything else, it gets a whole lot harder, and legally you have to start doing things legally, and that's not a battle that most people have the time for or the energy for. So again, it is very difficult. How to convince people above you that things are going bad is mostly documentation, right? Document everything, right? When somebody acts nasty to you, when somebody does something bad to you, make it very clear that you will use any and all approved channels to bring them to justice. And the reason that's important is that even if the person doesn't get terminated, even if they don't get rid of the person, it lets them know that you are not afraid to use any and all means at your disposal. Again, the best way is to, again, report through the structure that exists, right? But also make sure that you save, you know, if somebody says something nasty to you on a chat or something, you save screenshots, whatever else, right? Always do your best to keep as much evidence and receipts as possible so that you have as much power as you can going into these situations when the time comes. Again, this is not a great answer. I know it's not like, well, you just do this and everything is magically solved. It's not like that. And so I do apologize. But a lot of it, again, is finding support networks, documenting everything that happens, and always never being afraid to flex the approved, especially the approved channels for doing stuff, right? If you exhaust all approved channels and nothing changes, then you have to take more drastic action, and that's something that, you know, whether it's legal or something else, that's something that, you know, kind of done on a case-by-case basis, and you have to figure it out. But again, documenting everything, going to their supervisor, right, or your shared supervisor, and saying, listen, this person is doing these things and it's getting in the way of work, right? You know, always try to take it from the case of like, it's not that, oh, my feelings hurt, and if you're, you know, if they hurt your feelings and everything else, like, that's important. I'm not saying it's not important, but remember that a lot of these people, especially if they know the person's a jerk and they don't care, the way you appeal to them is by saying, listen, this is actually harming the community, and this is actually harming people's ability to get work done, right? The way this person is behaving actually hurts the way people are getting work done, right? I don't know. I mean, that's kind of like a bit of I don't know if that's exactly as concrete an answer as you would like, but I hope that answers a lot of it.
I think that answers it. Thank you. Let me mark this as answered. Let's see. We have another question, and it reads, have you found interesting mechanisms to work out these why people leave idea, and how to surface that activity to the community itself?
Oh, dude, I talk about that in my other video. I go through the whole kit and caboodle, like, how did we end up in the place we are? Why did people leave in the first place? Why, you know, because there's that very interesting graph, you might have seen it floating around, where there's like an uptick of women in computer science towards like the 60s and 70s, and then suddenly like drops off like a cliff, right? And I actually explain how they ended up in that situation, how we got to that place, the literal propaganda that people put out to make that happen, and everything else. And so a lot of that has actually already been researched. Especially if you live in the European Union, like, your tax laws has already gone to like public policy advisement on like why open source is the way it is, right? And again, I cite that in my last video, so you can go watch that and they'll give you a lot of those ideas. But if you're trying to work out why people leave, a lot of that goes into like, you just have to ask, right? When you notice somebody ejects themselves from your community, right? And again, they're not always vocal about it, so sometimes you maybe won't even notice. But when you notice that somebody leaves the community, right? Just reaching out to be like, hey, I noticed that you left. Did something happen? Right? It's almost like kind of like a neighborly thing. Like, you know, you notice your neighbor's having a hard time, so, you know, you go like, hey, you need some help? Is everything okay? That kind of thing, right? Being part of a community means actually engaging with that community, right? And so when you notice people leave, ask them why they left. If you're looking for historical reasons, I mean, there's actually people who do a lot of different research on this. Nathan Ensmerger spends a lot of time talking about how things ended up the way it did in computer science, especially in the United States. But there's also people doing this work all around the world. Brazil has a comprehensive research studies about what drives women into computer science, and actually got to a point where they got 50% parity in their STEM research subjects for gender, right? For male and female, right? They didn't include non-binary and other stuff, and I wish they did, but they didn't go that far. But yeah, a lot of this is well researched, and you can find a lot of that information. Working out in your own community literally is just it's kind of almost grunt work. It's surveys, it's interview, it's talking to people directly. It's not the most glamorous thing. There's no magical way that you can kind of just like hit the magic beanstalk and all the kernels of answers will rain down on you. But that's kind of just the way it goes. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Yeah, judging from the audience reactions, that seems to have covered it quite well. Let's see, we have another one, also on the topic of community moderation, which more or less reads, do you have any recommended code of conduct resources or examples of best practice?
Sure. So I think one of the, I believe it's like Geek Feminism. They have a template for, it's a Geek Feminism wiki. They have a template for code of conduct, and you can kind of just pull that one, and it's pretty comprehensive. Again, a lot of it relies on the it doesn't even matter the flavor of code of conduct, right? Because the code of conduct is just there to codify like things that are already existing practice in your community, right? So the best code of conduct is one that's kind of sourced from the behavior of the community, right? Now, if you notice that your behavior is composed mostly of jerks, and that maybe you have to figure that out, well, maybe you don't want to reflect it directly out of the way that the community is built, but it's sort of like that. Finally, there's also a couple. There's include CVP has their own one for how to moderate an online community, and that they do pretty well with that. Again, because it's backed by vigorous enforcement. And also Shepherd's Oasis has one for their upcoming conference and their online work. We adopted that one because it just seemed like a good idea. But it was mostly adopted off of the Geek Feminism Wiki combined with #include, and then we tweaked some stuff because we thought it would be better to mention some things. And we also sent it out for review to a bunch of different people so that they could kind of comment on it, right? There's also like the Contributor Covenant. They've got code of conducts and other kinds of things that they also put up there that you can use. And again, most of them are pretty good, and they cover most things, right? Again, you don't want to get into a place where you're always looking to make an exhaustive list of rules, because then, right, there are always people who do this, right? They show up and they read the rules very carefully and like, okay, I know that if I say exactly this, I can get away because it's not a direct rule violation. And what you need to realize is that you have to be able to enforce the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law, right? So if somebody's being an absolutely horrible person, but they're not saying that exact thing that is like a bannable offense, like, give them a timeout and be clear with them. Like, listen, you stepped over the line, right? Like, obviously, you don't have to ban everybody you don't agree with. That's like, community enforcement is very much providing warnings, timeouts, things that don't go all the way, escalate all the way to like, all right, it's ban hammer time. Like, you don't have to get to go all that way. But it's very clear, right, that you talk to people, that you make the expectations clear, and that when somebody does cross the line, you tell them, like, this is, like, that was not okay. Like, understand that this is not a direct rule of violation, but you are really making people feel bad and feel uncomfortable. And I understand that obviously this is not against the literal letter of the law. You're not saying something that's exactly homophobic or exactly transphobic or whatever else, but you are crossing a line here, and that needs to stop, right? So I hope that answers I think I went a little bit far there, but I hope that answers the question of how you come up with code of conduct, what are examples, where you can get them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it kind of seems like we need to be flexible with the rules in that sense, that just because something's not in the rules doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a violation of community integrity.
Right,
thanks
exactly.
for the answer. Yeah. Okay, perfect. We have one final question before we wrap this up, and it reads as follows. Let me put it on stage. If a person seems occasionally off and you're not sure if that's a genuine misunderstanding on their part or intentional, how would you go about that? Talk in private first and see if they're making changes?
So every time you talk in private, especially if you don't document it, you run a very big risk. And that risk is that they will constantly kind of be like, oh, I just need a little help from you. Thank you for talking to me. I'll make some changes. Then they don't make the changes. And sometimes even get worse. And because you keep talking to them in private, because you keep doing this on the DL, you have no documentation. You have no receipts. It's not actionable, right? So now you're in a situation where it explodes. It gets bad enough that things explode, right? And you look like the unreasonable one because you're like, wow, nothing happened, and then suddenly you're like exploding all over this guy. What's the deal? When in reality, this has been like a 6 months, 8 months thing, and you're like, I'm really sick of this. Like, this is unacceptable. But you kept talking in private, and you kept trying to be your own personal community moderator, and like that only goes so far. Right? I'm not saying that you can't just go to someone and be like, hey, I don't, that wasn't cool of you. I'd like you to stop. Please don't do that. Right? That happens, right? You can have that conversation, but don't make that the default way you approach literally everything, because that will stab you in the back, right? Even HR departments know how to use this against you, right? They say, listen, hey, whoa, hey, you don't have to file a report, okay? You don't have to send an email, okay? This is just between us ladies, right? Like we don't have to talk about that. I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it. And then it comes time for arbitration, and then it comes time for the legal part, and then that same HR lady who was like, oh yeah, everything's fine, will look you in the eye and say, she didn't report it. Not a clue what she's talking about. Title X, your Title IX officer at your school, oh yeah, they didn't say anything. Didn't hear a thing about it. Don't know what they're talking about. And now you feel like a fool, you feel manipulated, and you feel hurt. But at the end of the day, they're not losing anything. You're losing a lot. And now you're left to pick up the pieces. So be very careful, right? For small infractions, just have a, like, listen, I don't think that was cool, right? If they do it again, escalate it. Right? If they cross a big line, escalate it. You always want to be safe. At the very least, have some kind of paper trail. Make it clear, right? Don't just have like, I talked to him off to the side, right? Especially if this is happening in an academic or professional environment, send an email, do something. Rope somebody's advisor in, rope somebody's supervisor in. Don't let this just all go under the rug, because this is going to matter. If the person is nice and this just all smooths over, then it smooths over, and that email is just whatever. Who cares? It's an email. Nobody's going to do anything about that. But if this goes to arbitration, if this goes further than that, and all you had were a bunch of he said, she said that this conversation happened behind the lockers in hall 2B, you're in trouble. Okay, so as a person in a community, right? Small infractions, small things, and you can decide what's small and big to you, right? I'd always err on the side of caution, but yeah, be like, listen, that wasn't cool. I don't think that was necessary, right? If they keep doing it, then make sure that when you do send your official correspondence, like you screenshot the email you sent them or the Discord message or the Slack or whatever, and be like, listen, I had this conversation with them. They agreed to stop doing it. They've kept doing it. I am out of options, right? Because that also shows that you did your job, right? You did the most you could possibly do, right? So again, it's always good to have a paper trail. Always good to have it, right? Especially when somebody makes you feel uncomfortable. I was in that situation, right, where somebody put me in, somebody on Slack attacked me like real bad, like defaming of character and a bunch of other stuff, started yelling at me, called me dishonest, and a bunch of other crazy stuff that's happened in the CP link Slack. And it happened publicly too. And so what I did is I screenshotted everything, documented everything, and then left. And what happened is that other people started asking me like, hey, why did you leave the Slack? And I was like, oh yeah, well, this happened. I just turned over the screenshot. And like, yeah, this is what they said. This is what they did. And it was a 1, 2, 3 quick, easy thing, because nobody could question that I didn't fly off my rocker. I was very calm and composed. My hand, like, listen, I think you're being very, you're attacking my character right now. This seems very uncharacteristic of you. Like you're going way too far. Like we're just trying to have the design discussion here, right? And so that stuff matters. So you have to be careful. You have to watch out for that stuff. I gave you like a super answer, but I hope it covers a lot of different cases and makes you aware, right? Never get into the situation where you're always talking in private, because that is the way that abusers use that to get in, right? When I had that slide up that's about share early, share often, right? Like that applies to like this kind of stuff too, right? Like you don't want to be the one caught holding the bag. You don't want to be the one be like, oh, oops, I accidentally forgot to document anything. Now I guess I look like the fool, right? And it's one of the favorite things abusers love to do is they love to say she's lying, he's lying. I never said that. It never happened. And they'll look you dead in the eye and say that. So you need to protect yourself. You need to be careful. right? And again, if the person is normal and you just send a little email or mail a note, that's the end of it, right? Like, not everything is about escalating everything, right? So just be direct, be clear about your intentions, try not to blow your top, and when things get bad, always report to your supervisor, right? Even if you get to a point where you have to leave, always report to your supervisor and everything else, right? And obviously, again, maybe your supervisor doesn't give a damn, but at least you have the paper trail, and the paper trail will matter. Okay, yeah, sorry, that's a super answer. I hope that that helps you, Julia.
Thank you. Okay, great. So with that, we can wrap up this session. Thank you so much, everybody who attended. I would appreciate if we could give John Heat another round of applause with those emojis. Yeah. Just a heads up, as we wrap up this session, that we do have ShutdownPL lounge tables in the lounge section of AirMeet. So if you would like to continue the conversation, please join us there. It's going to be fairly unstructured, essentially for attendees to speak with one another, for us to talk about the presentation and so on. So feel free to meet us there after we conclude this stream. We also wanted to thank Bloomberg for their support, which, as we already mentioned, that goes directly into paying our speakers and into other activities aligned with the ShutdownPL mission. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much, John Heat. And I'll see you all on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll wrap up the presentation.